Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
Chimamanda, our conversation today has been titled Humanizing History and Connecting Cultures, inspired by comments you've made about the role of literature and the importance of challenging that notion of a single story. I want to ask, first of all, do you think that fiction in particular allows for the telling of a truth that's deeper than mere fact?
I do think so, but I'm particularly drawn as a reader and writer to the kind of fiction that's based on fact, if that makes sense. In writing fiction, I just feel very free. There's a sense in which I sort of feel that I can be radically honest, and by that it means that there's a greater depth and that it can illuminate facts.
So, are you saying that taking those historical facts and weaving stories about them, what is it then that sort of allows it to become something that's just not merely a story? Because, in the end, one feels a deep connection. How does that alchemy work?
I really don't know. I think maybe it's what I like to sometimes call emotional truth, and also maybe heart. When I was researching Half of a Yellow Sun, I tried to read everything all the books published about that period, and I talked to lots and lots of people. And initially, I put everything in the book because I thought, I spent so much time in archives and libraries, people have to know that I did all this work. So the first draft was huge, and I threw in everything. The French government's role, everything was in there. But I think at some point, the revising process was about me saying to myself, in the end, it's about human beings. I want people to read this book and come away, hopefully, thinking about what it means to be human in a situation of this sort. If you're reduced from, making sandwiches for your kids to having your child asked to eat a lizard, what does it do to you? So it was just sort of always telling myself it's about the human being. I want this to be a very human book. I want emotion to be at the heart of it, because that's what I go to fiction for. I want to be moved by fiction, and but how does it work? I don't know the formula. I sort of go with hope that it will work.
I've long wanted to ask you about this realist fiction, because I worried that you then exclude genre, but I was delighted to read in an interview that you wanted in Americana to write a love story, and I. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but I'm sure you mentioned Mills and Boon or Barbara Cartland, one of those respected and that made me really happy. So I wanted to ask you if you think that the genre cannot do it in the same way.
I'm not even very interested in this sort of debate about genre as good and something else called literary fiction as genre as sort of not good and literary fiction. For me, it's really something can be well written or not. And I do think that there are a number of books that we consider serious fiction that are fundamentally love stories. Love matters. Love stories matter. And I'm just, so I very much wanted to write a love story, and in a way that's very unapologetic. It's a love story,
For several years now, you've been running writing workshops in Nigeria, and I'm thinking about this idea of, telling a story, telling our stories. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the writers you've encountered and what they're wanting to write.
Last year, we had 2,000 people apply for 20 spots, which, and maybe 15% of that was just really rubbish, people who just imagine that they're writers. But the rest of it were people who deeply care about storytelling, read books, are interested in bettering their writing. And, I want to have class diversity, so you sort of can tell from the writing often, but sometimes from their dress, where they are, where they've gone to school, And it's very important for me to have that sort of diversity. And then I want men and women, and I want North and South and East and West. So I really sort of very carefully look at and what happens in the end, I think, is that we have a class of 20 people who represent Nigeria, and increasingly Africa, because, we've had Ghana, Malawi, Kenya, but it's that people then come there, and at the end of the workshop, they're doing such they're different. They're different. The way that they write has changed. And then there are people who are very much interested increasingly, I think, in writing about the sorts of things that we don't usually talk about. And I encourage that in the workshop. So now we have stories about gay Nigerians, right? We have stories that complicate this whole idea of corruption, because I think traditionally the idea is that the corrupt politician is a bad man. Right. But now I see people writing about corruption in more complicated ways, because that you are a public servant who is corrupt doesn't actually mean that you're a bad man.
That's interesting.
You know, so I see people dealing with those things more. And I think because under the military, cultural production went down so much in Nigeria. And at some point, I think maybe we started to think that we're not producing culturally. But we were. It was just a question of opportunity. And now I'm just realizing so many people want to write. So many people want to tell stories. So many people are interested in, and yeah, it's really, really quite diverse what people are producing.
It's exciting, and it strikes me as really important work, thinking about sort of, you've spoken quite eloquently about the stories you wrote as a child, you know, stories that are based on the British and American children's books that you were reading. And you spoke of how the work of Chinua Achebe gave you permission to write your own books. And it strikes me that the writers you're now encountering are perhaps living in a world where those stories, that permission is all out there. Do you think that they feel it in a way that perhaps you wouldn't have when you were starting out?
You know, I think we're making progress, but I think there's still, I did a workshop with some young Nigerian students a few years ago. They have much more access to books about realities that are not theirs than they do to books about realities that are theirs. It's just it's the truth, and I think it's not just Nigerians. I think it's all across sub-Saharan Africa. So you have these kids who they're writing the stories, and the characters all had strange names, you know, and often they lived in a kind of vaguely American it was just very strange, many of the stories. And then I would ask them, you know, what's your name? Chinelo. Why is your character's name something like, you know, Christabel? And they would say, because it's nicer. And I'll say, so Chinelo isn't nice. They're sort of quiet. And you know, because I recognized it, I know what it is. And so, you know, I did my rant about Chinelo is beautiful, Christabel, it doesn't have to be. But I think it's still there.
Well, thinking about that sort of almost one-way flow of what is culture and what is literature that you're saying still exists. I was sort of, you know, thinking about Achebe's naming you as fearless, which is sort of one of my favorite words, and it's an acknowledgement of the difficult task of telling the story of a conflict that has sort of torn a country apart. But I think the difficulty of telling the story not only to the people who experienced it, but to the rest of us as well. And perhaps it's about that, you know, telling it elsewhere that inevitably happens when a book is read as widely as yours is. And I just wondered, you know, having, after the fact, been called fearless, did you feel any kind of trepidation in embarking upon it?
Did I think now that I have been labeled fearless, I
mean before. Did you feel any...
You know, no, and I have to be honest and say I didn't particularly feel fearless. I didn't. And in some ways I was a lot more concerned about the people who had in fact lived in Biafra and experienced Biafra. I was a lot more concerned about telling their stories in a way that I felt gave it dignity and was true. And I mean, I really didn't think that anybody else would care about half of Ellah's son. So I was not at all consciously aware of the idea of, you know, I'm telling the world about Biafra. Really, what I was thinking was two things. I was thinking my grandfathers died in the war. If somehow dead people can see, what would they think about the book? And then also I was thinking about all the people who fought in Biafra and who lived through Biafra, and I was thinking, what would they think when they read it? So there was a lot of fear, you know, anxiety and fear, and, you know, half of Ellah's son was so emotionally, it took a lot from me emotionally. I mean, I would read about refugee camps and write a scene in a refugee camp, and suddenly I would stop and think, my grandfather died in a refugee camp. You know, my grandfather was buried in a mass grave. I very much felt that, you know, I inherited a sense of loss. And so it wasn't so much the I'm fearless, who's going to read this book. It was more just a deeply, very personal thing when I was walking in half of Ellah's son. But with this book, half of Ellah and I cried. This book, I laughed.
Yes, well,
and it's very good for my mental health because
there's a wonderful scene in Americana where I think it's Kimberly it's Kimberly keeps referring to these beautiful people she encounters. So this beautiful security guard, this beautiful cleaner, and we realize that beautiful is her euphemism for black. That cracked me up. I thought it was so funny. And I laughed a lot in this book. And I don't know why I was surprised, but I kept thinking, oh my goodness, this is all hilarious. And at times I think I was laughing, I was worried it was inappropriate. And so I did want to ask you about that. I wanted to ask you about the humor in the book. And obviously you wielded it with intention.
I made the conscious decision. I wanted to write about love, and I wanted to write about race, and I wanted to write about hair. So they're the things I wanted to write about. And there's certain, sometimes unspoken rules of what literary fiction should be and should do. And in the way that subjects are approached. So I think that the generally accepted way to write about race, for example, in the West, is that it has to be, the more meditative, the better. It has to be sort of lyrical, and it has to, everybody has to be ambivalent and everything has to be ambiguous, and you can't have characters and if you do have a character take a certain position, at the end you have to complicate it so much that you're not quite sure what the character thinks or feels, and at the end everybody's watery and fuzzy and nobody knows what, and that's the way, and I think because literary fiction has become a form that no longer challenges in a socially conscious way, this is the way you're supposed to do it. And I knew I could have done that. I know the tropes. Right? I could have done that. But I didn't want to, because I felt I wanted to write the book about race that I would like to read. And I also just wanted to write a book that felt true. So it was a conscious decision to write it the way where it's unsubtle, very happily unsubtle.
Well, I know I won't be the only reader who was grateful to you for breaking the rules. And I have to say that there were moments when we're reading Ifemelu's blog posts, which are direct and exhilaratingly confrontational at times. And I thought, I can't believe she wrote that out loud. Did you really say that? And whooping with joy, because there are things that we think, things that we experience, but they're not out there. And also, I think, as a reader, thinking of your wide readership and the conversations that would start, about hair, about, what hair means politically and in terms of self-image and so on. I wondered if you had experienced a kind of liberation writing this book. Did you?
Kind of, yes.
Yeah.
But also, when I was writing it, I was, mostly happy when it was going well. And then when I finished, and sort of my first readers read it, and my editor wasn't very pleased because my American editor felt that it should be more subtle. And then I was terrified. And then a friend of mine said to me, people loved you because of Half of a Yellow Sun, now you're in trouble. And I thought, whoa, okay, I need to find a day job. But also, I'm still very excited that it's actually out and that it's a book. I would do it exactly the same way if I had to do it again. I would, absolutely.
When we were speaking earlier about your grandfathers, to me, I heard a sense of almost responsibility in what you were saying. And, thinking about, a theme of that connecting cultures, this does it in a very different way, because I think that all those people who are maybe wanting the same writer to write the same book again and then find themselves with something entirely new and very contemporary and as you say, very in your face at times, will start a new conversation.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so. And I think also a conversation that we should have. Somebody said to me yesterday, or 2 days ago, I forget, because she said intelligent journalists have been writing about hair because of your book. And I said, the assumption is intelligent journalists shouldn't be writing about hair. But I said to her, people write entire novels about baseball.
Yes.
And this somehow is fine. And intelligent journalists write about baseball. Right? So why is black women's hair somehow something that we should find remarkable when it's written about? And when, so I thought these are, and race, I think, is also a conversation that, and even the idea of a conversation about race, I find very strange. I think race is something we should acknowledge. And there's such a discomfort around the subject. When you talk about race or write about race in a way that doesn't sort of keep everybody comfortable, which really means it's very watery. You're not really taking a position or saying anything. When you do that, I think people immediately sort of the way to sort of evade engaging with it is to label the person talking about it angry. So you have to be an angry black woman if you're saying that. And I find it very interesting. Very interesting.
Is that because there's a sense that you, as a black woman, as an African woman, have a responsibility? Because I often worry about that idea of having a responsibility or a role. How do you feel about that?
No, I don't think, I don't have a responsibility. I really love that young girls walk up to me in Nigeria and they say, I want to be a writer because of you. I love the sense of my people, right? I love that it means something to them. But on the other hand, I find myself sometimes resisting that kind of you're a role model thing because it can get very prescriptive. There are people who've said to me, this woman wrote me a very lovely email. This woman who's a dentist in Lagos, and she said, Chimamanda, you mean so much to us. My daughter looks up to you, but please, in your next book, don't write about sex.
Oh dear.
And it doesn't end there. She goes, and if you must write about sex, please don't make it enjoyable. That's like one of the best emails I saw. So apparently she felt that I wasn't being a good role model to her daughter by not only writing about sex, but making it enjoyable. So that's why I find myself resistant there. So, but in terms of a responsibility, no, it's not. I don't start off with this worthy idea of, I want to write about what I care about. And my feeling is that in caring about these things, that there are other people who care about them as I do, and that often these people share my biography in a way, that I think there are lots of Black African women who are concerned about the same things as I am, just because we, that there are similarities in the way we experience the world. So, yeah.
I want to ask you a little bit more about who you read, because there are all kinds of reasons we come as readers to your books. But I wondered about what gives you fuel. Who do you love reading?
When I was working this book, I've started reading a lot more poetry when I write fiction. And I don't read poetry in the same way as fiction. I sort of just let poetry wash over me. And I fell in love with Derek Walcott when I was writing this. I just think he's marvelous. So I got all of his books, and when it wasn't going well, I'd just sort of lie down and just read his poems. I read a lot of J.P. Clark, who's a Nigerian poet, Tanuro Jaide, who's a Nigerian poet, Gabriel Okara, who's a fantastic Nigerian poet. I read a bit of, so I would sort of go to the library and get the American poetry collections and just sort of, read them. This book, in some ways, is also my way of celebrating Graham Greene, who I actually really love. The Heart of the Matter is a book I just deeply admire. And so in some ways also, I think this book is also about books and about reading and the joy of reading.
Yes.
See, every time I'm asked about who
I know it's a terrible question,
sorry. I forget. I always forget.
Chimamanda, you've been so generous with your answers, and thank you very, very much.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.